Hello, I'm Robin Vincent and welcome to Molten Music Technology. Today, we're going to build an audio PC. Oh yes, a note about specifications. Now, this is just one of those things. Time marches on and technology changes. There's no way that I can give you a list of specs in order to build now, because in a couple of months it will probably be completely obsolete as Intel releases something new and technology moves on and it changes. However, I have found in my years of experience that there are a certain amount of consistencies that you can depend upon. So although I'm going to be talking about particular chipsets and particular processors, those sorts of things are less important than the general ideas that I'm trying to get across. Because when you go to buy your bits and pieces, you might find that the chipset I used, the motherboard that I used, no longer exists, and you're going to have to go for something else. So it's no good me saying, buy this motherboard. I have to rather get across to you the type of motherboard that you're going to need, the sort of things you need to look for when purchasing your bits and pieces. So I'm not going to give you a spec list. I mean, I can list the spec of the machine that I'm going to build, that's fine. But as I say, that will be obsolete relatively quickly, I imagine, because there's this general sort of 18-month cycle with Intel, and the system I'm going to be building today is getting on towards the end of that cycle. But there's a lot to be said for using a technology which has been around a little while. It's one of those tensions we get when using computer technology. You don't necessarily want to have the absolute latest, the absolute cliff edge kind of cutting technology. You want to have something that's been around a little while because it's more likely to work. There's revisions all of the time, coming out all the time to improve motherboards, to improve stability. So you don't want the beta BIOS, you want the release number 4, release number 5. You want to have something which is going to be stable and good, and one in which, you know, the bugs have already been ironed out. That's always going to be helpful. So don't get hung up on the specs, don't get hung up on the specs of what I'm going to be talking about. Try to take away the general ideas of what I'm going to say about it. And that should absolutely help you make the right decision. Right, so rather than talk about a list of specs, you can have a look at those in the description. I'm going to grab all of the bits and pieces and then we can talk about the choices that I made. Here we are. Here's all the stuff with which I'm going to build my audio PC. I think it's important to stress at this point that the idea behind an audio PC is one of quality. And that means looking for quality components. All the bits inside have to be of a decent level of quality. Otherwise, you're kind of defeating yourself. Sure, you can build yourself a cheap PC, but then it's going to operate kind of in a cheap way. It might be fine, don't get me wrong, could be brilliant. You might have built a PC for 100 quid and it's fantastic, well done, good job. But are you really going to leave those sorts of things to chance? You have to make sure that what's inside your computer is going to be stable and of high quality and is going to last you 5 to 10 years, because that's what we're after. We're after at least 5 years out of a computer. And so high quality is a must, and that tends to mean brands. That tends to mean brands like Samsung, like Corsair, like EVGA, like Intel, of course, like Asus or Gigabyte, brands like that, because that comes with it a certain amount of assurance, a certain amount of quality control. They will have return procedures, so if something is broken, something is wrong, you can return it and get something back. They will have support lines. You know, all of these factors are important when building a computer if you want it to have a trouble-free experience. So everything I've got here is good, high quality. Not necessarily the highest either. You can spend as much as you like, but there's no real need to. As long as you aim high for good quality bits and pieces, those are going to serve you well. And as a rough guesstimate, to build a half-decent audio PC, you'll probably need to spend £1,000. About £1,000, whatever that is in your currency. If you want to build an absolutely awesome computer, like this one actually is going to be, then you're probably going to need to spend about £2,000. It depends. I mean, a £1,000 computer built like this is going to be fantastic. £2,000 one is just going to be wider and bigger and deeper and quicker. That's it. You have to judge these things on your budget. And whatever your budget says, that's going to be an awesome computer for you and for what you can do. If you have more money, it just means, as I say, it gets wider and deeper and faster. But all of these choices will ultimately give you a computer that can run music software. And that's what we want. So let's start with the motherboard then. This is probably No, I see, that's it. I was going to say, oh, it's the most important component. They're all important. They all contribute. They all have a role to play within the system. But you have to start off with the motherboard because it's in which everything else sits. Now, what I've got here is a motherboard from ASUS. ASUS is a very respected motherboard making company. Another one is Gigabyte. They tend to be the two companies that I would recommend. I've used ASUS boards now for a long, long time. Every now and again I use a Gigabyte one if there's some change or some difference, which means that there wasn't an ASUS solution available. And in all respects, both of those platforms tend to do really well in the audio PC world. Now, words of caution. The biggest PC building part of the industry is all about gamers building these massive, crazy, overclocked rigs. And that's fine. And so the industry as a whole caters to them. Because us specialist builders building for creative purposes are a tiny, weeny part of the market. So nobody really cares about us very much. But they care about gamers. So when you go onto the ASUS website, you'll find stacks and stacks of motherboards called gaming this, gaming that, or, you know, Fortnite this, or shoot that, or explosions, or super overclock something or other. And that's all fine, but those sorts of things are a little bit unnecessary. If you dig around on the website, you should find a calmer range of motherboards. And that's what we want, because we don't want bells and whistles. We want good, solid stability and performance. We don't need overclocking, which I'll come to in a bit. We don't need special integrated audio or special integrated this, that, or the other, or super. We don't need anything that's super. We want good, hard-working stuff. And for ASUS, they have a range called Prime. And Prime tends to be their more standard stuff. Now, which motherboard should you get? And that really invites the question as to which chipset, because motherboards are based on particular chipsets. Chipsets designed that are on here, the chipset is on the motherboard, designed to run the in and out, and runs with a particular type of processor. Now, generally speaking, as I say, these things change, but generally speaking, this is going to be the hardest part to get across, is the motherboard and processor connection and how that works in a world out there that may be after these have already disappeared. Generally speaking, with Intel processors, there's a number of different ranges. I mean, they confuse the hell out of everyone by calling everything an i5 or an i7 or an i3, because it's completely false. It makes every processor sound like it's the same when there are distinct categories and levels of processor. So at the most basic level, there are two levels of motherboard and processors that interest us. You can, of course, go as cheap as you like down the bottom end of stuff, that's fine. However, what I would recommend is that you aim for desktop and you aim for workstation. You've got desktop. Now, desktop generally means good mainstream systems. That means we're talking about a chipset called the Z390. And that chipset runs with the desktop mainstream i7 and i5 and now i9 processors. The current range of processors that refers to are called Coffee Lake. Now, none of this makes any sense. I appreciate that none of this makes any sense. However, what we have to see is that you have a desktop system, which is the mainstream system. That's a good starting point for an audio PC. You want to look at getting a Z390 chipset with a desktop i7 or i9 processor, which are also currently called Coffee Lake. Now, these specs, of course, are going to change. So what you probably need to look for is an Intel Z chipset, because that number beside it will change. And then an i7 and an i9 processor, which goes along with that. How you match those up is in terms of how big the socket is on the motherboard. This socket here. Because this is of a certain size and it's only compatible with certain processors. And so on the Z370, it's an 1151 size socket, and that's only compatible with the 1151 processors. See? No one's ever going to understand this stuff. Best thing to do is to talk to your computer shop, talk to your supplier and say, I want a desktop system, one that runs a good, stable ASUS board and a good, stable i7 or i9 processor. That's what you want to do. Then there's a level up. There's a level up from that, which is what I'm building today, and that's called the workstation level. At workstations, you're tending to have more expensive motherboards that are put into high working environments, rather than the desktop, which is aimed at being the home PC, the office PC, the middle of the road PC, which can still make an awesome audio PC. But with workstation, you're looking at that next step up. Currently, the chipset for that is the X299, and the processors which go along with that are the i7 and i9 Skylake X. See, this is never going to get you anywhere. All right, so let's boil this back down. That's what I'm going to be doing today. I'm using an Asus Prime X299 motherboard, and I'm going to plug into it a Core i9 processor, a Skylake X processor. Now those things, as I say, these specs become unimportant really quickly. So just to summarize again, for an audio PC, you either want a desktop system with i7, i9, or a workstation system with i7, i9. Desktop systems tend to be good mainstream performers. Workstation systems will be that step up, higher, bigger performers. So let's have a closer look at this motherboard. What are we after on a motherboard? We are after an ATX motherboard. That is this size. You can do it smaller. You can have micro ATX or nano ATX or whatever you like. However, ATX is the good standard size. It's going to mean that you'll be putting it in a good standard case, which in terms of airflow, in terms of noise, which is something we'll talk about more in a minute, that's going to be advantageous. The other thing is that within this size board, there's no compromises. Nothing's been miniaturized in order to make that fit onto a smaller board. It has the biggest amount of bandwidth that you can run through the PCI slots, and it has the greatest amount of RAM that you can put on it. Also has the most ports for drives and bits and pieces. So a good standard ATX board is what you need. And all that's important on this thing doesn't have to be scary. Processor goes here, power supply goes in there, memory goes into these slots, hard drives go into these slots. And if you have any cards, which you don't really have them anymore, except for the video card perhaps, then they would go into these slots here. The other current consideration at the moment is Thunderbolt. Now, if you want to put Thunderbolt into your system, you have to have a motherboard that supports it. This may change. Intel are already trying to integrate Thunderbolt into the processor itself, and that should hopefully make that a lot more available. But currently, you have to add it on as a card, but you can only add it on as a card if your motherboard already supports it. So you need to look into that first. And it will have a port on it somewhere which says that you can plug Thunderbolt into it, and it's Thunderbolt compatible. On the back, you will get audio, which we don't care about. You'll get USB sockets. Doesn't matter if they're USB A, B, C, D, G, whatever. It doesn't matter. It will be compatible with whatever your audio is. As long as it has USB 2, then it's going to be compatible with the majority of audio interfaces. It'll have a network port, which is great because that's always going to win over Wi-Fi. And we do all know that we do need to be connected to the internet in order to authorize your software and your plugins and to download updates, that kind of thing. Now, if you'd bought into the desktop level of things with, say, a Z390 motherboard, then that's also going to have video outputs on here. Video ports, HDMI, that kind of thing. Because in those desktop processors, you have an entire graphics engine built in to those processors. On the higher level workstation side of things, you do not. You have to have a separate video card, which is what we're going to be doing today. Without getting into the specifics, and the specifics are down in the description, then it's really hard to get across the general idea of what you're after. But hopefully, my rambling enough about it has shown you what it's about. So the next factor to go along with it is the processor. Now for this is a flipping awesome processor. It's a Core i9. It's a i9-9900X, 3.5 gigahertz. It has a whole load of cores in here. It's going to be flipping amazing. Don't have to have the biggest processor in the world. The processor needs to be one of the things that you absolutely factor into your budget, because the more and larger and faster processor you have, the more plugins you can run. It's kind of that simple. The more polyphony you'll get in your virtual instruments, and the more your system will just be able to handle. So the processor is a fundamental part of your audio PC, and that's the thing you need to direct your money at more than anything else. Because although you can, of course, upgrade down the line, you can change your processor, the likelihood is that you won't. Because by the time you've got to the point where you'd quite like to upgrade your processor, say 4 years down the line, that processor will no longer be available. So you can't. So it's always important to aim high and get the biggest, fastest, fattest processor you possibly can. Now the processor has to match your motherboard, has to be the same thing. So you see on here, this says 2066, LGA 2066. That's the form factor of this processor. And so the motherboard has to have a socket that matches that, LGA 2066. If you're doing a desktop system, then it will be LGA 1151. Currently, that of course may change. But provided that they are the same, then they should be compatible. Again, the place you get it from should be able to answer those questions if you have any. Next up then is memory. In this system, I'm sticking in 128 gigabytes. 128 gigabytes. That's an enormous amount. No one would ever need 128 gigabytes, but that's what's going in this fella. Now, I would recommend on any system an absolute minimum of 8 gigabytes of memory. 8 gigabytes of RAM, memory, same thing, okay? Can't get this out of here. How do we get this out of here? Okay, sticks of RAM, looks like this. I'll have 8 of them, 4 aside, because on the workstation platform is actually a quad system with a memory. You put 4 in either side and that runs with the processor. Again, you need to get the RAM that matches your system. Your motherboard will tell you what sort of RAM that it takes, and so buy RAM that's appropriate to that. Now, Corsair Vengeance RAM is excellent. Aim for a good brand and don't buy their value stuff. Buy the decent stuff, the stuff that's got heat sinks on it. Go for good quality RAM. Now, the only question that really comes up is what speed RAM, because RAMs are all sorts of different speeds these times. Now, with an audio PC, you are not looking to overclock, because overclocking can introduce instability. We don't want that. Don't want instability, so we're not looking to overclock. We want to run everything fairly standard. So the sort of speed you want is going to be at the fairly standard end. So you don't want the fastest RAM they possibly do. You want something like 2666 RAM or 2400 RAM. Something along those lines. When you look at what your motherboard is compatible with, look at the bottom end of the speeds that it's compatible with, because that will be the non-overclocked speed. And that's going to be what you want. So remember, we're making sensible choices, good, high quality choices, choices that are going to make sure that our system is as stable and high performance as possible. But stability needs to have a higher emphasis than performance, because you can have a super duper fast computer, but if Cubase is falling over, if Pro Tools is crashing, if your virtual instruments are wigging out, then that power is of no use to you. Has to be stable. Stability is the key. Another major factor in your build is going to be the power supply. Power supply. These are enormous things, but they are vitally important, and it's the one area that people often skimp on, and you shouldn't, because the power going into your system is one of those things which is most likely to cause it to trip up, to reset, to crash, to freeze. To not work properly is going to be an underpowered power supply. So what should you do? Well, there's tons of people out there who'll tell you all sorts of interesting, fascinating technical details about power supplies. Really, I'm not that interested. What I have found over the years is that you just aim high. You aim to spend somewhere between 80 and 100 quid. You aim to get a power supply that has around 650 watts to spend. And if it has a color associated with it, go for a gold or platinum one. Don't go for a bronze one or one that's not rated at all. Go for one which has a rating of gold, because that means that the quality and the tolerance within the power supply is as high as possible. And that means you'll get uninterrupted flow of power, you'll get no fluctuations, it won't go up and down and won't cause any resets or any problems. And it will feed and fuel all of the bits you put in your system, including lots and lots and lots of drives. There are calculators out there where you can stick in all your components and it will tell you what sort of wattage your computer needs, but they tend to be on the conservative side. And actually, you are always going to need more than you think, and it's safer to give yourself a bit of headroom and a bit of a buffer. So, a 600 watt, a 650, 700 even, or above if you're building some twin CPU monster. But generally speaking, for a good quality, safe, stable, absolutely awesome system, 650 watt gold power supply from someone like EVGA or Be Quiet or Corsair or something like that going to be ideal. For SSD drives, always get an SSD drive as your system drive. I'll go into drive configurations later on in the build, but for the moment when you're buying stuff, buy one SSD drive at the very least, which is the one on which you will be running Windows, because that will massively improve the performance of your system as a whole. I really like Samsung. The Evo range has been excellent all the way along, and they just keep getting better and better and bigger and cheaper. They have a Pro range, by all means go for that, but I found the general mainstream Evo range to be excellent. Mechanical hard drives. Remember these? Yeah, well, we still use them because we have a lot of samples to store. We have a lot of audio and video to store. So mechanical hard drives are still very much a thing. The best you can get, usually, or Western Digital, these 4 terabyte ones, are flipping awesome. Amazing. Now, spindle speeds. This all sounds very boring, but it's important. If you are streaming samples, if you are recording audio, then you want high spindle speeds. What does that mean? It's the RPM number. So if you buy a mechanical hard drive, it will have an RPM like 5400 or 7200. You want 7200 every time. Don't be tempted by the slightly cheaper 5400 ones. So for instance, with the Western Digital ones, they have different ranges. They have a blue range and a green range. You don't want those, you want the black range. The black range is the 7200 ones. I've also got a Seagate Barracuda one here as well, which are also decent. They're a bit more mainstream. They seem to do the job well, although they've got more confusing of late because their Barracuda range used to all be 7200 and now they seem to have changed, and so they're different things. So you have to look very carefully at the specs to make sure that it's a 7200 drive. Very important. Cooling. Cooling is very important, which is also going to be a big factor of the case, and we'll talk more about this during the build. But it's very important to get a really good cooler. Do not ever use the stock Intel coolers. No, don't ever use them. Spend a few quid, 40 quid, and buy yourself a proper, decent, active cooling solution. What does that mean? It means it's in a massive heatsink like this is. There's no picture on the box, unfortunately. Really, a massive heatsink with a couple of fans on, and that's going to draw the heat off the processor and keep it cool and keep it stable. That's what you want. Nice, big, fat, huge heatsink, large fans. That keeps the noise down and it keeps the cooling up. This is a great brand, Noctua, excellent. All of their stuff is excellent. I can highly recommend it. The only thing you need to check is that this is compatible with your motherboard and is also the right size to fit inside your case. Finally, the graphics card. Now, it shouldn't really matter so much. With an audio PC, you're not looking to run games necessarily, although you may want to. There's not any particular issues involved with graphics cards these days. If you're building a proper computer with a good, decent motherboard, then graphics cards are not going to upset your system one way or another. Generally speaking, I tend to go for graphics cards which are low powered or lower end of things, simply because they are quieter. They are not running such high-end GPUs and so don't need all the cooling, and so they either don't have fans at all. If they do have fans, then they are slow running and quiet, and that's what you want. So get a video card that suits what it is you want to do, suits what monitors that you've got, and be aware that the higher you go up, the noisier they are going to get. So this one here is a GTX 1050. I think it's got a single fan on it. It's very, very quiet. Does the job. Finally, just a word on the case. Don't skimp on the case. You can buy cases for 15 quid, that's fine, but don't spend 100 quid on it. Why would you spend that? Well, because you'll get a better quality case. Better quality in terms of materials that it's made from, better quality in terms of the airflow and so the efficiency of your system, and also that has a massive impact on the noise and cooling of your system. There are some great cases out there. You're going to have ones that look bonkers and crazy, flashing lights and stuff, if you wish, with windows in the side, all that kind of rigmarole. Or just get something good and understated that's going to be made of a decent metal with decent acoustic stuff inside, and that's going to give you the room to work. Again, if you're trying to do all of this on a micro ATX board or a nano board or something like that, then you're not going to have much room to work, and the air is not going to have much room to go, and the heat will have nowhere to go. Nice big case, an ATX case, is going to fit everything in well, going to have room to work, you'll be able to pull things in and out very easily, and it's going to make your life a whole lot easier. So don't get a 20 quid plastic case. get a decent one. Get an aluminium one. Get one that's going to look really nice in the environment that you're putting it in. Now, I appreciate that this appears complex, but I've tried to give as much information as I can in order to help you as best as possible. I think to run over these things really quickly would just leave you more confused. And so I hope spending time a little bit on these, and I'm going to talk about these more as we install them. I hope those sorts of things are helpful. But if you want a really quick summary of all of that, when buying your list for an audio computer, choose quality brands. Make sure your processor matches your motherboard. There tends to be two levels. There's a workstation level, which is for high-end computers, and that will give you the best performance. And there's a desktop level, which will give you great mainstream performance. And both of those will work. Get high-quality memory. Get high-quality drives. Don't skimp on the power supply. Get a decent one of around 650 watts that's at least gold certified. Get yourself a decent big fat cooler for the processor, and don't worry so much about the graphics card. Get what you need and be mindful that the more powerful the graphics card, the louder it's going to be.